I'm always looking for ways to show my cat how much I love her. And with Fancy Feast gems, I can pamper her whenever I want with a savory gravy on top of a gourmet mousse pâté. The pyramid shape makes serving simple, so all I have to do is peel and plate to make mealtime feel extra fancy. And with 2 entrees in every pack, it's easy to turn every day into the extraordinary. Fancy Feast gems.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold, soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
This episode of the Tudors Dynasty and Beyond podcast is brought to you by Mrs. Bakewell's. Mrs. Bakewell's classic English scones are lovingly handmade in small batches using only the finest ingredients, offering a true taste of tradition. It's also the first cream tea company in the United States, and I have had so many of these, I cannot recommend them more. They are absolutely delicious. I shared some with my sister this weekend who has been to the UK, and she thought they were absolutely phenomenal. So please check them out for yourself. Head on over to mrsbakewells.com.
This is the Tudors Dynasty and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back to the podcast. My name is Rebecca Larson and I am your host today, as always, and I am welcomed by the very lovely Dr. Linda Porter. Welcome back.
Thank you, Rebecca.
You know, you're here today because we're going to do our second episode in the Queen's Husband series. And the first episode that we did was back in August, and that was on August 19th. And we talked about the husbands of Mary, Queen of Scots, didn't we?
Yes, we did. Yes. At least this is only one husband we're talking about at the moment.
Yeah, that one was a little busier. Today we're talking about another Mary's husband, and this time we're going to be talking about Mary Tudor, Mary the First husband, Philip. And this is a fun topic because I feel like there's so much to talk about with these two. And I'm not sure where to start, but I did want to mention that I feel like Mary choosing Philip was such a controversial choice in England at the time. Is it still fair to say that?
It's probably less controversial than Elizabethan subsequent propaganda would have you believe. I mean, he was in many respects an obvious choice because he was her first cousin once removed. He was the son of the Emperor Charles V, who was her first cousin. And of course, no one had thought it was particularly odd when Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon, and she was Spanish, but a considerable amount of time and an awful lot of religious change had, as you're sort of alluding to, taken place in that time. But I think one of the things that interests me about Philip and is that perhaps I can correct some of this impression that the whole of England was up in arms when she finally decided, I think pressured by her own sense of duty and who she was, and also by the very wily imperial ambassador, Simon Renard, who was quite brilliant at his job in this sort of way, when she finally did make the decision. Because, I mean, let's face it, she's 37, nearly 38 years old and a virgin. You don't really want to start considering marrying someone at that age, because, you know, the whole sort of sexual activity side is probably not going to be a lot of fun for either of you. But I mean, he was the obvious choice in terms of his power and significance in Europe. At the time that she married him in 1554, he was already had been given by his father Charles V the whole of Spain to run, and the Netherlands as well. So that was his particular area in what is now the Netherlands and Belgium. And eventually, the following couple of years, Charles V abdicated and divided his huge Habsburg lands, which were essentially all of Europe that wasn't England or France, basically. And he gave to his younger son, Ferdinand, or I should say his brother, actually, the lands in Austria and Germany. So Philip was still left, of course, with a vast domain, not just in Europe, but in the growing Spanish Empire, the whole of the Hispanic Empire in the New World. So he was a man of enormous influence and power. He was the greatest prince in Europe, basically, which is rather ironic because, of course, Elizabeth would later say that she wouldn't marry anybody, even the greatest prince in Europe, whereupon, of course, as soon as she became queen, Philip offered to marry her. But that is another story, though I might get to it towards the end a little bit because it does connect. But I think he's still not very well known. I think if you were to go out in the street in Britain, and I don't know how many people it would take, maybe thousands perhaps, who know that we ever had a king called Philip, and upon discovering it would probably be quite affronted by it, actually, and offended. But we do have a king called Philip, and he was the husband of Mary I. And his own background was very much unlike hers. And if it's okay, I'll say a little bit about it because I think it helps you understand him as a person. He'd been born in Valladolid, which is more or less in the center of Spain, and was for a while the center of the Spanish court in May of 1527. And he was eventually the only surviving son. He had brothers, but they died, of Charles V and Charles V's wife, Isabella of Portugal. And they had an unusual marriage. It was pretty happy, actually, when they saw each other, and literally years would go by, literally years, when they didn't. And Charles was so often away on campaign that he left his wife either pregnant whenever he came back, and or as regent for him in his absence. So she had to bring up their children essentially by herself. And finally, Philip was joined by two younger sisters, Maria and Juana. And he didn't really know his father very well. There's a period of literally 4 years in which Charles is away campaigning in Italy, and Empress Isabella is in charge in his absence. So Philip has a proper Iberian heritage in the respect that his mother is Portuguese, and his father, of course, was half Spanish because Charles V's own father had been Burgundian, and he was brought up, obviously, surrounded by women until his father decided this wasn't a good idea and gave him his own household, which is typical of all royal males in those days in Europe, and indeed for a century or more to come. So Philip eventually got his own set of tutors. Huge emphasis on religion. His mother was a very, very devout woman, and he clearly was very fond of her and his two sisters. And he grew up in this extremely religious atmosphere and one of piety and devotion, which would never leave him. In fact, he became more inclined in that direction as he got older. But he appears to have been a fairly healthy boy. He was not very good academically for a long while. He should have been able to read a lot better than he could at the age of about 7, 8, or 9. And that part of his education had to be attended to. He never spoke languages very well either, which was a contrast, of course, to Mary and Elizabeth, who were both extremely good linguists. He spoke Castilian and obviously fairly good Latin. And he understood French, but doesn't seem to have spoken it very well at all. In fact, his father at one stage despairs of him ever mastering the language. And Philip himself acknowledged that he couldn't speak it all that well. And this is interesting, of course, because when he married Mary, people have often said, well, how the hell did they manage to communicate? What did they talk in? And the answer is he spoke in Castilian, which she probably understood fairly well. And she responded to him in French. This is what people now think. And anything else, was conducted in Latin, which sounds to us a very strange way to conduct a marital relationship. But it's probably not untypical of many diplomatic marriages in Europe at the time. But Philip wasn't very good at languages. And so that made him, in some respects, not an ideal suitor for Mary, but she did cope with it. And he had been married quite young, at the age of 16, 17, to his Portuguese cousin, Maria Manuela. And Charles V, who had issued all sorts of instructions to his son, do this, do that, highly specific, very, very demanding and difficult to follow, particularly as regards ruling and all that kind of thing, has essentially said to him, he sent memos out to this and even to the head of Philip's household, for God's sake, make sure he doesn't spend too much time having sex with his wife. Now, needless to say, this left poor Maria Manuela rather puzzled, and out of it so much, really. It's very sad what happened to her. I mean, obviously, they must have had a number of encounters that worked, because she became pregnant at a very young age and died at the age of 17, having suffered a massive hemorrhage when she did give birth to his what was to be for many, many years, most of his life, his only son and heir, Don Carlos. And Philip seems to have felt sudden, overwhelming remorse for the fact that this poor young woman that he had given the cold shoulder to, basically because Dad told him to, had died this very early and sad death. And in researching Philip for the book that I'm writing at the moment, I was astonished to discover that this poor Portuguese princess is still largely written out of history. And the latest biography of Philip in English, I think it's the most recent, by an eminent British historian of Spain at the time, doesn't even mention her name. She's in the index, but you need to know what she's called. I mean, she's referred to as the Princess of Portugal in that, and there are about 2 lines about her. So I feel very sorry for her, but she disappeared from the scene. But I think it's interesting that Philip was already a widower at quite a young age, and the father of a son who would later become, as probably people know, a tremendous difficulty and burden to him, because he had, Don Carlos had obviously a number of mental problems, which seemed to have been made worse by a head injury. He eventually died in very mysterious circumstances, but he was his father's heir. So when Philip came across to England to marry his cousin, who was 11 years older than him, which is probably not a very attractive prospect in itself, though such marriages can work sometimes, depending on the parties concerned. He was already, in a very responsible position in terms of ruling Spain and the Netherlands. He spent most of his time in Brussels, actually, rather than, though he did go back to Spain from time to time. But his younger sister Juana was left as regent there. And she's, again, another woman that I don't think we know very much about. Probably they do in Spain, but I don't think we do in non-Hispanic speaking countries. So Philip was... Charles V announced that he might have married his cousin Mary. His wife Isabella was dead by then, but that essentially he was too old and tired, which is fair enough. So a treaty was negotiated, which Mary participated a lot in the actual, how it was eventually written, and Philip was not allowed to take any part in it at all. But the one thing that I think is not well understood, it wasn't for many years, and I have to say that when I wrote my biography nearly 20 years ago of Mary I, I followed what was then the popular view that Philip had no influence in England at all, and this is not true. I mean, there's been a lot of scholarship on Philip and Mary recently, and on their marriage, insofar as we really know anything about it in the personal sense of it. And it has become quite apparent, if you look carefully at the records, that Philip had far more influence than people used to think, that he got reports of all of the council meetings. He attended quite a few. Presumably the meetings were held in Latin, I think, or maybe in French, because all of the British diplomats on the council and all of the councillors would have spoken Latin and French. So again, linguistically, the only problem there would have been for Philip, whose only known utterance in English before he departed from his wedding feast was "Good night, my lords all," which Mary had taught him to say by then. And he's not known to have spoken any English subsequently at all. But so there you have this youngish man, still in his 20s, marrying a woman whose entire life had been, almost until that point, from the age of 15 onwards, at any rate, one of great difficulty and challenge. And she was prematurely aged. Since her mid-teens, she'd not been in very good health at all. She was small, still red-headed. She hadn't gone grey, as far as we know. She had what at the time was described as a very deep voice, which must have been funny in contrast to her father's, because Henry VIII's voice is supposed to be rather high-pitched and squeaky, which must have felt odd coming from that huge bulk later on. But it may be that Mary had a rather attractive contralto voice, but of course that was not considered very womanly in those days, or she may just have been rather hoarse and gruff. We don't really know. But aside from the age difference, they did have quite a lot in common. I mean, Mary wanted to be part of Europe. She wanted England to be greater in Europe, in total contrast to her sister, of course, later on. And she saw this Habsburg marriage as allowing her to achieve that and make her country a major player on the European scene. And there being all sorts of safeguards put in the marriage treaty, so that, Philip would be regent if he had a son, but he would probably, if it was a daughter, if they had a child, then she wouldn't inherit any of his Spanish kingdoms. So there were quite a lot of, I suppose, what we would call almost break clauses on both sides of this. And Philip arrived in the very wet summer of 1554 with a group of enthusiastic Spanish courtiers whose enthusiasm was soon quite literally dampened by the pouring rain, because it was a very wet summer, who'd left Spain thinking that England was the land of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and full of flowers and leafy lanes. Well, it may have had some of the latter, but the other was long since gone. So, they were all, I think, thoroughly depressed and disabused. And Ruy Gomez, Philip's secretary, more or less gives the reader, I think he was reporting to one of the other diplomats over in other leading ministers over in Brussels at the time, my God, my poor master has had to go to bed with this woman. And he said the queen was a good creature, he said, which is sort of like damning with faint praise. And it would seem that the wedding night was probably pretty difficult on both sides. Mary didn't appear in public for 4 days afterwards. Mind you, Henrietta Maria didn't appear in public for several days after her wedding night with Charles I, and she was only 15, and one presumes much more sort of flexible, as it were. But anyhow, of course, Mary did hope to have children. And one of the saddest things about the marriage itself is that even though she was 38, she hadn't given up hope of having children. And in fact, just a few years later, after her death, Philip's cousin, Emmanuel Felibert of Savoy, as part of the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, which ended the Habsburg-Valois struggle, married the spinster sister of Henry II of France, Marguerite, who was then 35 or 36 years old. But she produced an heir, at the age of about 37 or 38. And you only need one after all. So,
Yeah.
but Mary, of course, was not so fortunate. And I mean, she thought she was pregnant. And the whole tale is probably well known to most of your listeners. It is very, very sad. It was almost certainly a false pregnancy. I mean, Mary was not the only woman to experience this sort of thing at the time. You have to remember that it's an age of profound gynecological ignorance. And she did show signs of being pregnant, but apparently you can during false pregnancies. I mean, we have instances of other false pregnancies at the time, including Honor Lyle, the wife of the one of the last people in charge of Calais. She had a false pregnancy. So this is not some peculiarity to Mary I. It's not unheard of by any means. And Philip, of course, stayed with her all of the time until it became abundantly obvious that there wasn't going to be any child, at which point he had to leave to go back to the Netherlands because that was his responsibility. I think a lot has been made in the past of the fact that he deserted Mary and she was heartbroken, blah, de, blah, de, blah. Yeah. But she always knew that he was going to do that. Given his responsibilities, he couldn't have swanned around in England. It would just not have been possible. And as soon as he could leave, he did, though he came back, of course, for a while in 1557 when poor Mary fancied she might be pregnant again, though nobody believed it at the time, including him. And she's often represented, and I may have been guilty of this a bit myself in the past, though I don't think I was as over the top as many people used to be, as being madly in love with him. But as Dr. Alex Sampson, who's perhaps one of the leading authorities on Mary and Philip at the University College of London, has said, we actually don't know anything about the personal side of their marriage. We just don't know. They had in common interests in music and masks and acting, and they kept a very cultured and magnificent Renaissance court, which again is not known. And you think of Mary Tudor and you think, God, it must have been awful, all these people sitting around in corners looking grim and wondering who on earth they can send to the stake next. But the court wasn't like that, and Mary had a great sense of humor. Apparently she liked to laugh a lot. I can just imagine what some of your listeners might say, but I can tell them now not to bother because it won't make any difference to me. But this aspect of the sort of magnificence of their court, and the fact that she was not just a Tudor queen, but also a Habsburg queen consort, is quite often overlooked. But Philip, I mean, God bless him, he did his best, and he was as dutiful and polite a husband as he could possibly be, but he did not desert her. And we don't know whether she actually was streaming tears when he left from the steps at I can't remember whether it's Greenwich or Whitehall now. I think it's Whitehall. But it's often said that, Mary stood at the window in floods of tears. Well, her eyes may have been watering, but she was terribly short-sighted and couldn't possibly have seen this tiny figure down in a boat on the river about to leave. So there are all sorts of myths about their marriage that I think should be dispelled. But the one area that's of particular interest, I think, is Philip's relationship with his sister-in-law, Elizabeth, because of all Elizabeth's subsequent suitors, he was one of the few. She did meet a couple of others, but they had actually met. And what we don't know, I mean, if we know little about the sort of day-to-day realities of Philip and Mary's marriage, we do know that, as I said, he played quite a prominent role in government, and certainly he saved Henry VIII's navy from rotting in the docks. Henry's magnificent navy. Now, he didn't do this for altruistic English reasons. He did it because he wanted Mary's support in his wars with France. But nevertheless, it was an important contribution and one that Elizabeth would benefit from eventually. But if we don't know much about his personal relationship with Mary, we know even less about his relationship with Elizabeth, which is curious because he was, much to Mary's annoyance, a considerable supporter of his sister-in-law during Mary's reign. We don't know how often they met. We know that they were in the same places at certain times, but we can't be sure. There is only one instance I can find at the moment of their having met face to face, when in the sad sort of debacle after Mary's pregnancy was realised to have been a false one, Elizabeth rode with the two of them from Hampton Court back to Greenwich. And it would be pretty hard to do that without actually coming face to face with someone, I think. But and she was very grateful to Philip, of course. And in the early part of her reign, she had a good relationship with Spain because she couldn't afford not to. And eventually, of course, he offered to marry Elizabeth, and which he did with a great show of reluctance, that it was a duty God had put upon him. But we don't know whether he actually quite fancied his red-haired sister-in-law, who was a lot younger, more graceful, more elegant than Mary, not beautiful, but probably more attractive to a man of about the same age. He was a few years older than her, of course, 6 years, but. So, it's not just the relationship with Mary that's interesting with Philip. I think it's the relationship with Elizabeth. And I've been trying to find out quite a lot more about it. But it did annoy Mary, who I think, until really Mary came to the throne, she'd had a good relationship with her sister. They hadn't seen each other much during Edward's reign, but we know they remained in touch with each other and that they exchanged servants and wrote and all that sort of thing. So Philip, I think, of course, as soon as he realised towards the end of Mary's life that his wife probably wasn't going to survive, he needed to make sure that he was on good terms with Elizabeth as the heir, and he pushed Mary to accept her as the heir, which Mary did eventually, of course, whereas Elizabeth never named an heir. So it's odd, this kind of contrasting relationship he has with the two Tudor sisters, and Philip and Elizabeth's relationship, whatever it was. One could write a nice historical novel about it, but much of it would be fictional. But I have occasionally thought of doing it. But no, really, Philip and Mary's relationship was not predicated on the fact that he'd be constantly by her side. So we need to dispel that and understand the responsibilities he had in the wider European scene. But on many levels, it was a marriage that worked surprisingly well, given the age difference between the two. And Mary didn't always do what he told her. Despite liking the idea of being an obedient wife, she ploughed her own furrow increasingly in his absence. He could issue advice and instructions, but she didn't necessarily take it. But as the Queen's husband, he is the first husband of an English queen, not a British queen, as we know, because we've already talked about Mary, Queen of Scots. But that's, that in a nutshell is what I think I'd like people to remember of him, that he was a young man, already a widower with a child, a son and heir, with huge responsibilities, even though his father had hived off the Eastern, the German and Austrian part of the Habsburg Empire, who'd already known considerable loss, who was accustomed to being with women, actually, and perhaps that explains how he managed to adapt himself to his marriage to Mary I at all, and who, yes, he saw the possibilities that could accrue to him in England, and he still was seeing those as a possibility after Mary died, interestingly enough, or he wouldn't have offered his hand to Elizabeth, who eventually she refused him quite quickly, but she let him down quite gently. I think they were both relieved, actually, probably. It's interesting to speculate what on earth Europe might have been like had they married, because she would have been left completely in charge of England, of course. Elizabeth didn't see England becoming greater in Europe through that route, or possibly indeed through any route at all, really. But Mary did, and it was a contrast between the two sisters. But Philip wasn't a nobody. He wasn't, written out of English history as soon as he got here. Many of the English aristocracy were perfectly happy to welcome him. They saw in this powerful young man, the prospect of pensions and glories in warfare and all this sort of thing. And it's not true that most of the population opposed it. Some of the nobility did, notably Sir Thomas Wyatt and Jane Grey's idiot father. But basically, there was a division of opinion, and a lot of it perhaps centered in London itself, because as a capital city, throughout history, the apprentices there had been a bolshy lot, and they didn't like foreigners. I mean, the English not liking foreigners is nothing new, I can assure you. We were xenophobic years and years ago, and there was ill feeling, and there were, if you were Spanish, you probably best kept your mouth shut if you were out and about on the streets of London. They were a horribly dangerous place anyhow in those days. But I think Philip is often overlooked as someone who's merely a footnote to English history, and probably a rather distasteful one at that. I mean, his role in encouraging Mary to persecute Protestants is not entirely clear, but he certainly didn't oppose it. So he was in that respect very much a man of his times, and if he thought that it was necessary to impose Mary's rule as monarch, then obviously he would have gone along with it. But I think it's interesting to think about the fact that they weren't both sitting around glaring at each other in the evenings. There would have been music and plays and that kind of thing, and they were important European monarchs, something which is often overlooked in connection with Mary. But his dealings with Elizabeth are, of course, another story. But it didn't start out as a negative relationship at all. That took a good many years to develop. And eventually, of course, Philip, somewhat to Elizabeth's chagrin, we think, as soon as she had turned him down, in the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, he agreed to marry another Elizabeth of Valois, who was 14 years old, so a lot younger than Elizabeth, and an attractive, well-educated girl. And it was a very happy marriage, unfortunately brief, less than 10 years. She bore him several children, but only 2 daughters survived, and eventually she died in childbirth at the very early age of 23. And after that, he married his niece, and she was the one, which is probably, the Habsburgs intermarried too much already by this stage, but it wasn't unheard of. And she finally produced the son who became Philip III, his only heir. Don Carlos, as I said, his early heir had died in mysterious circumstances some many years previously. So I think, he is the great European monarch. I'm sorry to those who think it's Elizabeth I. It isn't. She was little compared to Philip. And he is the great colossus that bestrides 16th century Europe, whether you like it or not. And he died, of course, at what was a fairly great, he was older than Elizabeth was when he died. He was 71. He died in 1598, so not that long before she did. He was a workaholic. His empire stretched thousands of miles. His treasury, despite the fact that there was a lot of gold and silver and stuff coming in from the New World, was often exhausted and depleted by wars. He was a micromanager before the term had ever been invented. And I must try and find this somewhere, but I think it's true that, in his dealings with Spain, and the Italians hated the Spanish, incidentally, far more than the English ever did at the time. But in his dealings with Italy, one of his servants there is supposed to have written, "If death were to come from Spain, we should live forever." Because, Philip was not good at handing over responsibility. And it did play his inability to do this, which is something he hadn't entirely learned from his father, because of course his father had handed over responsibility in 1556 when he abdicated. But Philip never really did. And he annotated almost everything and agonized over delays and all that. But of course, he did make Madrid the capital of Spain and built the Escorial, this amazing palace on a sort of gridiron plan out in the hills outside Madrid. And he was perhaps archetypically the late Renaissance prince. So there he is.
I feel like I learned so much about Philip today that I didn't know, especially when it comes to languages. I had no idea he was not very good with languages.
Well, of course, I think we tend to assume that everyone in those days who was educated must have been. But I mean, like nowadays, I presume there were people who struggled with it more than others. And certainly it was a source of displeasure to his father, who felt that, you really should be able to speak good French. And Philip just couldn't, and he doesn't seem to have made a great deal of effort in it. I mean, Elizabeth, on the occasions when they did meet, would have spoken to him, I suppose, in French, possibly Latin as well, because she would have been fluent in both. But I think, again, it surprises people, not just that perhaps Philip was a far greater monarch in terms of his power and influence than Elizabeth, but also that English, of course, was not spoken outside England, and it wasn't considered to be plumb diplomatic posting at all. People didn't want to come here as diplomats, and when they did come, they wanted to get away fairly quickly, quite often. No one spoke English. So if you needed to communicate, you needed basically French or Latin. I think Elizabeth spoke quite good Italian, but I don't think Philip spoke any Italian either. And I don't know how much Spanish she spoke. I think she may have spoken some, but Philip, of course, had been brought up not even, as far as one knows, to speak any Flemish, which would have been the language of his father, Philip the Fair. And again, I think we need to dispel what is often the certainly English view of Philip. Because he was Spanish, he must have had a head of massive dark curls and gold earrings. He was actually thin and fair. He didn't look remotely Spanish. And yet, he's always known as Philip of Spain, which he was. But he's a fascinating figure. And I think he's obviously not overlooked, I think, in European history. I don't suppose the French have a great deal of cause to like him, really. But of course, the ending of the Habsburg-Valois struggle was important. Other problems would beset Philip very soon afterwards, such as the beginnings of the major revolt in the Netherlands, which resulted in the division of the two countries into what became the United Provinces, the Protestant bit, and the southern Netherlands, which were the Catholic area. And that, in a different form, persists until today, of course. So Philip had many responsibilities. And he used women, of course, amongst his own relatives. Juana in Spain when he wasn't there, his aunt Margaret of Parma to govern the Netherlands. And I think he was a man who actually liked women in the sort of general sense that he probably viewed them as the weaker vessel men in his day did. And we find him writing to Elizabeth later on, essentially saying, I do think it would be a good idea if you married my cousin, the Austrian Habsburg Charles, who was the brother of the Habsburg emperor at the time, because being in charge of a country is a very weighty thing for a lady. You can imagine Elizabeth's response if she didn't, as an aside, at any rate, to that. But he wouldn't have been ahead of his times in thinking women could do things like that. But he was very accustomed to working with women, I think, in government.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
No one should have to choose between their own safety and their pets. But nearly half of domestic abuse survivors delay leaving because they can't bring their pets with them. Purina is helping to create more pet-friendly domestic violence shelters through the Purple Leash Project, so survivors and their pets can escape and heal together. Visit Purina.com/purple to learn more.
I find this okay. So you had mentioned that Philip helped Mary improve the English Navy. And I find it interesting that then many, many years later, that English Navy defeated the Spanish Armada.
Yes, it is. Of course, a lot of work had gone into it since then. And I mean, it's 30 years later, of course. And the defeat of the Spanish Armada, of course, I think had less to do with I'm not a naval expert, so I'm going to be careful what I say here. There was a difference in the kind of ships that they had, but it was mostly a failure of planning, as I understand it, at any rate. I mean, I think views of what happened to the Armada seem to go through, 30 or 40 year cycles, and then someone comes up with something new. I mean, and yes, we have the view of Francis Drake nipping in and out amongst all these Spanish ships. But it was actually the weather that defeated them as well, of course. It was dreadful, and they got blown all the way up around the coast of Scotland, where some of the sailors eventually found land and integrated with the local population. No, it's an interesting story, and I'm not an expert on the Armada at all. But Elizabeth's speech to the troops at Tilbury, of course, in which she castigates Philip, thinks foul scorn that the King of Spain or any other blah, 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 should attack her country, is a very far cry from the young woman of 25 who knew that, especially if she were to achieve a reasonable relationship with France, she needed her brother-in-law. And we forget that they are a brother and sister-in-law. In most European royal families, these people didn't meet very often, but they did and had known one another when young.
Yeah. Oh, Dr. Linda Porter, thank you so much for coming on today and speaking with us about
You're
Philip
welcome.
II. I can't wait for our next episode.
That's someone much later. That's someone Dutch. William III. Yes, he's not very well known or even very well liked either, but he's a fascinating man, and I will try and talk to you about him in the not too distant future.
I very much look forward to it. Thank you very much for today.
Okay, bye, Rebecca.
Thanks for listening to Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you never miss a new release. And if you loved it, leave a quick review. It helps more history lovers find the show. Want to support the podcast and get bonus content? Head to patreon.com/tudorsdynasty. You can also find the link in the show notes of this episode. Join the conversation with Rebecca on social media at Tudors Dynasty. Until next time.